So, very warm welcome to the session on Merve Sancak's new book, Global Production, National Institutions and Skill Formation, published in Oxford University Press. Came out this year, so congratulations, Merve. So we've got a great panel of 3 speakers, and each one will present their comments for 10 minutes, and then Merve will have some time to react, and we can have then a sort of a reaction from the critics, and then general discussion, I think. So I think we should go in the order that it's in the program, and I don't know how this came about, but just so that people can follow online who is speaking. So we'll start with Aldo Madariaga from the Universidad Diego Portales, then Geoffrey Wood from Western University in Canada, Fulya Apaydin from Institut Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals, and then, Merve Sancak from Loughborough University, London, will react to the comments. So, Aldo, when you're ready. So I guess you will have to use the microphone as well, or you could get up and speak from the... if that's maybe easier,
Hello, okay. All right, thanks for this invitation, and thanks for the opportunity to read this great book. I was telling Merve, I don't remember the last time I read a whole book. I had the time to read the whole book in a few days, and I really enjoyed it. I just want to start with a short story. I met Merve a few years ago at the conference when I first heard about her work on skills. And actually, I think you sent me your dissertation at the point, and you asked me for comments, which I never did, and I'm still so embarrassed. But I'm very glad that I never did, because this work came out so well, and I think I would just have screwed it, or I don't know what else could I have added to this very excellent research that became this book. I think the book addresses what is, if not the key, surely among the top 5 key issues for the development of non-advanced economies, namely skills formation. Let's check on the time. It asks about the conditions that can lead to what Merve calls high road development, for which skills formation is crucial. Why? Because it facilitates social inclusion via better jobs and lower inequality, reduces gaps between smaller and larger firms, and allows them to compete in higher value-added industries and thrive in an open economy. Thing is that while we know how important skills are for development, we know very little about the politics behind it, that is how to get there, and this is precisely and what the consequences they produce, and this is precisely where Merve's book comes into scene. I think the book skillfully combines the literatures on global value chains, comparative capitalisms, and employment systems / human resource management, with an intense fieldwork in the auto parts supply industry in 2 large non-advanced economies, Mexico and Turkey, to understand firms' skilling decisions. I think, and I'm not mistaken, if I say that this is the first book-length, in-depth, and focused study of the premises of the comparative capitalism's literature in non-advanced political economies. I mean, we have the books by Ben Schnyder, Ilan Bisberg, Andreas Nölke, but then these are big overviews of different countries using diverse data and from different realms. And I think this is, if not the one, among the first studies in depth, one of the key issues of the comparative capitalism's literature for non-advanced economies. So a big, pace setter there. In terms of theory, I think the book is both concise and convincing. It provides a multi-level theory explaining how international pressures from the value chains where firms are located and that stem from their diverse government structures create different pressures for firms' hiring and training decisions, and how firms solve these decisions based on the constraints and opportunities available in national institutional environments, namely skills formation institutions and other complementary institutions like labor market ones. On this, I might say that while it follows very closely the comparative literature, comparative capitalism's literature, mostly Busemeyer and Trampusch, it also departs from it and applies it in a non-naive way, I would say, which is reflected, for example, in the treatment of the issue of complementarities, always complicated, but in a very simple way, just finding the complementarities that are the most important for these countries, in this case, and some very interesting, for example, how public transportation infrastructure can be complementary to skills formation. This simple yet convincing story has the merit of washing away two of the main criticisms of the comparative capitalism's literature in one stroke, particularly on the skills formation side. First, breaking the methodological nationalism of this literature by showing that firms' decisions are embedded not just in national institutional settings, but also and crucially on an international one, and this is the case of global value chains that set all sorts of pressures on them. And secondly, by incorporating the crucial role of the state in broadening skills investments and therefore really making possible their social inclusion and economic upgrading potential. In this sense, I really think the book helps connecting the dots between international comparative political economy, which is a major achievement. In terms of empirics, the book is rich and grounded. The book Merve not only did extensive research with firm representatives and other stakeholders in her native Turkey, but also in Mexico. And I have to say that having myself done fieldwork in Mexico and being a native Spanish speaker, this is no less of an achievement. I often found myself lost in all the regional institutional practical differences and complexities of the Mexican state and the large list of names and acronyms in Mexican political economy. So Merve's capacity to survive the Mexican jungle, as one of her informants calls the Mexican educational system, is really noteworthy. The book is very concise in general and provides a very clear answer to its question. The main difference between Turkey's more robust skills formation system and rapid improvements in reducing inequality and in firm productivity, particularly in small and medium enterprises, and Mexico's weaker skills formation system, persisting inequality and large firm differences, lies in the role of the state. Particularly the capacity of the states to broaden the relevance of skills formation and its scope, meaning combining technical dexterity with general formation to allow higher labor market and career opportunities, provide a pool of skilled workers available to SMEs, and then allow the economy to thrive. So the book is concise, theoretically rich, empirically grounded. What else can you ask for in a book? Now, of course, I also have a few issues that I would like to share with you, and then some also critical remarks and questions. First, with such empirical grounding, I felt that this book sometimes becomes a bit too schematic and I miss a little bit of texture. I often found myself wanting more detail about the type of firms that we're talking about, what specific tasks are being carried, and in a way, instead of synthesizing a lot of information that the book contains, trying to go deeper into specific cases, and I mean, this may very well become a paper in itself. Related to this, well, the book, I think, is very well structured and very, it follows very reasonably from one point to the other. In a way, the meat of the book comes at the very end, which is precisely skills, firms' skilling practices and how these international constraints and national institutions come about when when firms decide on their skilling practices. So I would really encourage you to take this and maybe produce something else, because I think this is really where the heart of it is. Although you justify and you say what you don't delve into a discussion on the politics of skills, and you say, for this moment, for this book, I will assume that firms are institution takers and not institution makers. I think it's really difficult to think that sometimes some big firms just take norms as they come, particularly when they're trying to shape their value chains, and they look for advantageous conditions for investment in different countries. So in Mexico, for example, one of those advantages is precisely their capacity to actually broker with particular states and get tailored solutions for their skills formation systems needs. So I think even though we can do this analytical distinction, I think we cannot really detach the picture from the politics behind it. On the role of institutions, I think you problematize rightly the functioning of institutions in the context of non-advanced economies, but I think you don't apply it that much to your cases. I mean, in the end, you say that institutions in non-advanced economies can also become beneficial constraints, following Streeck's famous formulation. But actually, my question is, are we supposed to expect firms to comply with regulations in these countries? Minimum wages, hiring regulations, regulations regarding apprenticeship, certification, etc. Right? You rightly say that institutions in these countries are not fluid or incomplete institutions. They're not transitioning to something else, right? But we also say, and we have several volumes on this, that they're weak institutions and they're diversely enforced. And we have the book by Brinks, Levitsky and Murillo on weak institutions in Latin America. We have the book by Alicia Holland on forbearance and how actors go around institutions for all sorts of reasons. So I think this merits more discussion. Also, on case selection and scope, you select 2 cases which have several similarities and differences, but I would like, and you follow them thoroughly, but I would like more discussion about the scope conditions for this analysis. So are the results valid for, say, Brazil, Malaysia, Colombia? Some of the charts and data that you include also Costa Rica, Czech Republic, Hungary. So, you know, there are wide differences in size of the countries. And the book says that actually the size of the country may generate differences in firm strategies in how they cope with the external pressures. So maybe we need to think more about, you know, how to apply the conclusions of the book to different countries. Also, same with the automotive industry. What happens if we move to another industry or from suppliers to a different moment or place in the value chain? Okay, just 30 seconds. Questions? On the issue of automation and skills obsolescence, you say that automation is not too developed in the non-advanced countries, so it's not a problem, but you also say that VET in this industry promotes precisely the type of mid-level skills that are more often automated according to the literature. So I think this creates a puzzle. These industries either provide mid-level skills and then are in danger of automation actually, or they provide lower skills and are not automated. But then, if the latter is the case, it means that actually skills formation strategies in these countries have an upper limit that is related to the cost advantages. And in this sense, the highway development is an elusive target, right? Related to this, the issue of flexibility, I'm going to finish with this and in a second point. You say that Mexican sort of skilling is more arm's length regime and provides many problems, but one advantage is actually flexibility. And maybe when you have automation, you need more flexibility. So how will Turkey do with this need for more flexibility in the context of higher automation? This is my last question. The conclusion of this book says that more robust and more encompassing role of the state in Turkey is also closely related to the renovation of state corporatism, and we know its authoritarian traits, right? So state intervention means also higher authoritarianism in this case. Is there a way to go around this? I mean, if we want to go the highway, then we need more state, but then this leads to authoritarianism in the case that you study. So maybe actually Mexico avoided authoritarianism, and neoliberalization goes along with democratization in Mexico, and this is the way they had to go for avoiding a reversal to corporatist authoritarianism. So is there a way of solving this problem? Okay, let me just finish by thanking the opportunity to read and comment on this book and congratulating you again, Merve, for the excellent product.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Geoff, you're next, if you don't mind. Okay, in my 10 minutes, there are just 3 themes I would like to address. The first is obviously I would like to compliment the book for what it does, because, as you know, the original literature on comparative capitalism treated the firm very much as a conveyor belt. You'd have certain institutions, and then there was a firm-centered analysis, something what would happen in the firm, and then you'd have some of the societal outcome. So though the firm was supposedly central to analysis, it was this sort of mysterious transmission belt. Now, interesting enough, this wasn't just a fault literature comparative capitalism. The literature on law and finance, and the finance literature had much the same problem. There was a sense of, the mysterious things that go on in the firm, but you have these kind of broad outcomes. Now, then there was obviously a second body of largely comparative HRM. The two big things will obviously be the Cranet survey, then that comparative survey by Paul Edwards and co. of firm level HR practices and multinationals. Now, both those studies took an institutional perspective and looked at HR within the firm. But then there was, again, a gap, and that was the articulation between institutions and the firm. There's just some of your big institutions out there. Firms go then manage the people on the way. Okay, they were right, found patterns, but there wasn't much about those interlinkages. And I think what I like about Merve's book, and this is a big strength, is trying to draw out these interlinkages. The second comment is just a observation, fairly brief one. One thing we know about populist politicians, they tend to like making up policy on the fly. As they go, they tend to have these sort of very quick, high visibility things, and they actually don't really care if the policies work or don't, as long as they can draw attention to themselves. And as in the case of England, notoriously Boris Johnson remarked once, I don't care if there's chaos because everybody looks at me then, so it's actually quite a good thing. And you could argue Erdogan at times does follow a similar logic. And this is quite interesting between attempts over the years to have industrial policy in Turkey and that kind of policy making on the fly. I think that's... I would just like to, more of a critique now. Okay, we've got the positive features, observation, and now the critique. Where I had a bit of a problem, I don't think necessarily the book's wrong, I just think it's part of the picture, is the whole notion of captive value chains. Now, on one hand, it does paint to a basic truth. There has been this logic over a number of years of the automotive majors moving over parts of core production to the tier one suppliers and investing in them quite extensively. And this goes certainly within the automotive industry, often even on the production line. I mean, I've seen a car plant where there's actually the cars coming down the production line. On the side, the workers putting together the steering column and the switchgear, except they're actually suppliers. They're sitting on the factory floor assembling steering columns. So you do get that. That's perfectly true. However, there's another big thing of automotive supply chains that's happened. And that is that automotive supply chains in many areas have become very much more obscure. There's been a huge rise of these producers of low cost, we think of car parts as sophisticated things, but there's lots of basic stuff, bolts, hinges, screws, basic, entering the market from China and South Korea, typically supplied by intermediaries. And nobody really knows where the stuff comes from. Because, I've spoken to people in the automotive industry again, I've spoken to tier one suppliers. And these people, will say, quite honestly, we don't know where the stuff comes from. We find it very unsettling in a way, because we used to have very close relations with local suppliers, even down to quite small workshops, there's one company I know, they were just making the hinges for car bonnets. But they, over years, not a huge company, but they had close relations with supplier, and that's all gone now. So in other words, that there has been, and people in the automotive majors, the tier ones, say they don't like this necessarily. It's very disruptive, but look here, it's a competitive industry. We've got to cut costs somewhere, and this is a very, very easy way of cutting costs. So you could argue maybe captive value chains was a logic maybe 10 years ago. Perhaps the logic now increasingly is the sort of vanishing of a good chunk of the value chain. Now, you could argue, it doesn't matter, the tier ones are still there. Some of the bigger tier twos are still there. But if you take away that smaller components out of the picture, a lot of the jobs down the automotive value chain just goes. And this is an issue, you know. So perhaps you might say in chronological time as we enter the new phase. Of course, the other thing is that what's interesting about automotive industry, it is a very labor-intensive industry. It creates a hell of a lot of good jobs. And it's, you know, in many countries around the world, this has been a huge component of manufacturing. However, of course, a very, very obvious observation is electric cars actually require far fewer parts. You just don't have the gearbox. You don't have lots of parts in your engine. Electric motor is actually a very simple thing. Okay, there's some electronics, but electric cars are much, much simpler. So a lot of the automotive supply chain jobs are going to go. It's just a simple thing. And where does this leave countries who built quite a big chunk of industrial policy around automotives? And it's not just places like Turkey or Mexico. You could argue places like Slovakia or South Africa are even much more reliant on it. So this can have a huge disruption around this. And I'm not altogether sure where this leaves industrial policy. Is there any other industry out there that could replace that? Who has that kind of demand for skilled work? And the answer is, I really don't know. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to engage with this really, really nice book. I've prepared slides, so I'm going to be speaking with slides. Okay. So I guess other discussants have summarized the argument, but just briefly, the book makes really, really three very important contributions. The first contribution is that, you know, Merve skillfully shows that globalization does not standardize skills in the global south. There's a huge deal of variation out there. The state plays an important role, and that she makes this argument at the conclusion, which I think I would like to spend more time on, that higher state involvement is more likely to enable skill systems, contribute to high road development. So this is the third important argument. Now, this is basically the visual representation of the causal chain, if we would like to take a moment to take a look at it from the book. And she does this by bringing the micro and the macro level together. She basically has this multi-level focus, which I think is very, very important, especially in a comparative setting by looking at Mexico and Turkey, not just at the state, not just at the institutions, but also global pressures and firm responses are part of the explanation. Now, I think this is a very timely contribution. The focus is on two peripheral economies, Mexico and Turkey, and quite frankly, skill formation systems in these countries have not really gotten much attention. I mean, I've done some work on this before, but I mean, it's not the sexiest of all subjects to study. The focus is on sectoral, the focus is on automobile parts producers. This actually is based on qualitative, in-depth work, field work in both countries, which is, quite laudable. I think it needs to be recognized because it is really not easy to go door to door and then ask for interviews, especially in a very, very, male-dominant industry. Now, what I really, really liked about this book, and I'm going to make this case about why you should read it too, and you can basically think about, John Coltrane in the background, what are my favorite things. I really, really like the presentation of evidence. It's immensely detailed. I mean, if you read this book, you will know how workers acquire skills in Mexico and Turkey. And there's an important causal mechanism that basically brings these macro and micro and meso levels together, to basically show that national institutions are critical, state matters, and then globalization pressures. Yes, they influence, but the outcome is not standardization or de-skilling and other expected outcomes, they don't really apply to cases in the global south. And I think the book also shows, which I really, really like about, here, because most of the theories that we have on skill formation systems are based on cases from the global north. So I think this comparison of emerging capitalist economies reveals that, you know, this landscape is more diverse, more variegated. So we need to basically also look at what's going on inside these countries rather than just, you know, dismissing them as cheap labor. And it also makes an important policy suggestion with respect to the implications for development, this link between skill formation and high road development link. Now, what I also wish, and here comes a critique, I think maybe I will echo some of the comments that were raised by Aldo and Geoff here. But I think it would be nice to see a little bit more detailed discussion about the federal versus unitary system, because I think particularly in Mexico, the decentralization under a federal setting led to a completely different outcome. Maybe you could have discussed a little bit more, or maybe you can say a little bit more. I mean, you can't rewrite the book, right? But about what this does to local state capacity. As opposed to national state capacity, because, you know, the education is under the jurisdiction of local states in Mexico, whereas the opposite is the case in Turkey. So how does that actually influence the outcomes, especially during the 1990s with respect to the link between skill formation systems and subnational state capacity? The second thing I would like to hear a little bit more your thoughts on is the role of regional organizations, regional organizations like NAFTA or EU in the case of Turkey. A lot of the standardization, for instance, the certification systems that Merve talks about in the book happen under EU integration process. So there's this great pressure, especially in the case of Turkey, to basically push forward the standardization of skills and certification that you extensively talk about. I'm not really sure about the case of Mexico. I don't know that case that well, but I'm not sure whether NAFTA had a similar expectation. I think these two are quite different, or if they did, maybe they had a different channels for which they actually imposed this by directly contacting the firms. I'm not sure. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And the third thing that I would wish to hear a little bit more about, the historical processes. I mean, the book's focus is on the 2000s. Fair enough, but you know, what are the historical processes that basically led to the formation of these institutions? Just very briefly, like where did Mexico and Turkey start to diverge if they were both ISI-led economies, and then what happened along the way? And some more. I think one thing that I'm curious to hear more about, yes, you know, the focus is on the supply side, the institutions matter argument is very important, but yes, firm demand is very important, but what about workers? Are workers completely passive takers? Do they not react or respond in any way to these certificate and skill formation systems? Do they embrace it wholeheartedly, or do they actually contest these requirements that basically push them to the edge? So, and relatedly, I think 2008 crisis is also a critical juncture in both countries in that sense. What happened to the institutional landscape, especially after 2008, the political processes, especially during this process, seems quite noteworthy, especially political polarization. I can speak from the case of Turkey. How did that actually affect skill formation and standardization of skills in both countries? Did that have completely no effect, or is it irrelevant? I would really hear a little bit more about that. Now, going forward, as Geoff also mentioned, I think the role of e-car production is very important as well. They require significantly lesser number of parts. An average mid-sized car that we drive around is about, I think, 10,000 parts. This is going to go down to 3,000, I guess, something like that. How does that actually, you know, what kind of implications does that have on the future trajectories of skill formation systems? And I'm this point on inclusive growth, and this is I'm not fully sure whether the link between skill formation and the dominant role of the state leading to high road development applies really to the case of Turkey. Given the fact that, you know, there were multiple crises due to different dynamics, But I mean, the growth and this inclusion and wage increases between 2002 and 2008 were effectively driven by access and availability of cheap capital in global markets. And after 2008, the picture basically changes, right? So how much role does skill formation have on higher road development, as you argue in the book? How much does it how much impact does it have on development when growth is effectively dependent on the inflow of foreign capital, right? So I guess these are all my comments, and I really, really thank you for the opportunity to engage deeply with your work, and to everyone else, I recommend that you buy this book. It's 30% off. Thank you.
Merve, you've now got the chance to reply for them.
Thanks everyone, thanks Jeff, Aldo and Fulya for your comments. Thanks Gerhard for moderating, and thank you all for coming here. First, I really want to thank you. This is my first book ever, and it's out there. I don't know what's going to happen, if people are going to like it, so I'm very happy and humbled to hear that you liked it. Of course, there are questions, and no, I don't think any book or any paper or any book, anything is going to resolve all issues. And most of the questions you raised, I would say I had those myself. And I have answers to some of them. I don't have answers to some other. So let me see. So I'll just start in the details. I have some notes here. So although you say some detail about firms, I agree. So I think the point was there, is just to talk to as many firms as possible. And one thing is that I also aim to talk to local firms only, like Mexican firms and Turkish firms. And actually, I was very surprised, and I think it will relate to my answer to some other questions you raised. In Mexico, it was very hard to find those firms. In Turkey, it was easier. I think it's also maybe because of my connections, but also in Mexico, domestic capital firms in the auto industry are disappearing. It is very few of them. And it will come to the question of the e-car and the impact of the changes in the auto industry on what I'm saying. Yeah, and I think maybe because of that, some more detailed about certain firms and would be good. As Jeff gave so many examples, the firms I talk to are the ones that are producing the very basic products. Most of them. There were a few cases that are more complex compared to others, but it is just like a metal part that is then put on a door, or like a little plastic bit that's then is put on a door handle kind of things. It's like very basic. And so I try to give some information about what the firms do, but I think it would be more difficult to do it in a generalized way. So maybe, like as you said, go into one paper, talk about one firm only and see what they do could be interesting. But as Fulya mentioned, skills isn't the most attractive topic. And if I go to one firm, look at what they do, I'm not sure how many people are going to read that. To be honest, and I think it was actually in Thalian's book 2014. It's in her preface that skills are not the topic that people are interested. Yeah. I think you talk the firm skilling practices. You said come at the end. It should be before. That was so this book is based on my PhD, and in my PhD I actually was like, this is the institution, this is the skill formation, this is the institution, this is the skill formation. But then I just changed it for the book, and especially to make it more readable, but maybe the old structure might have been better in that sense. I agree the firms aren't just institutional takers, and they're institutional makers. And yeah, I get your point. I don't have any opposition to that. Yeah, and the implementation can be different. You said what are the institutions are, and I think it's related to your other question. The firms. You said institutions are weak, and there are institutions, but they're weak, and firms can find ways around it, and it might vary. But I think I kind of try to show it in the book too. That is actually the case more in Mexico than in Turkey, and I think because of the like weaker institutions, maybe in Mexico, firms have more flexibility, which you also mentioned, to go around those institutions. And in the end, I can't show it here, it's somewhere in the book. In Mexico, we actually end up with so many different types of skill formation practices compared to Turkey. It is very much more similar in the Turkish firms. So maybe that what you say in terms of institutional weaknesses and the firms finding way around that is more relevant for Mexico compared to Turkey. And I would say then it is related to the question of state power and how much the state has control on firms. And that is, on the one hand, is the state power because, so one thing, for example, in Mexico, the state requires firms to provide training, but doesn't do anything to see if it happens and to what extent it happens and what type of skills are provided. But for example, on the other hand, Turkish state is requiring firms to employ workers only with certificated workers, and they actually comply that. They fine firms when they don't do it. So when the state is that much stronger, then the firm's compliance is higher. And then does it lead to the authoritarianism? That's a question I have had for a while. Because also skill formation, vocational education, the relations between firms and businesses was also the case in developmental states, in Korea, in Singapore, and we also had examples of authoritarianism that came with development, actually. So I think you raised the right question. Do we end up with, does development come with more authoritarian states? I don't know. I think I have had that question myself. Yeah, I think that's all those questions. Jeff, thanks a lot for your comments. It's basically, Jeff read this book maybe the second time, but the first time it wasn't a book, it was my thesis. He was my external examiner in my PhD thesis. Thanks again for also reading this version of this. And at that point, you had other comments. I guess I managed to address them, so now you didn't raise them again. I think one of them was the automation, actually, which everyone mentioned in this panel. So that's and then I came up with this actually part in the book. Automation has these companies, the Mexican, Turkish companies that I looked at, they are not automated. They have very limited automation. I also visited the plants. I saw what is happening. It's very manual labor. So I think it's related to your question, Aldo. So once the automated machines come, it is not these workers with technical skills at secondary level, but it is the workers that do post-secondary level training or engineering level training. So those are the ones who are operating the more automated machines. The ones at secondary schools, they are still doing the more manual type of work. And so what is actually, maybe I'll just answer this question directly. So how is the automation affecting these countries or the skill formation systems or the automotive industries? I think it is, this is not something I did in the book, but that was a question I had. It is not helping these countries or the skill formation systems or the companies. They increasingly disappear. They either are taken by foreign companies or they start producing for, I would say, downgrading. So they actually start producing for the value chains that have lower value added. For example, many companies I talked, they started also producing for furniture manufacturing. For example, if they are producing metals, and they also started producing to the furniture companies, but also electrodomestic products. So if they are, it's kind of related to what they have been doing, but because they are getting all these pressures related to price and automation, so they are moving downward. Or some of them, very few of them manage to upgrade, but it is very few of them. Related to your question about captive value chains, I think it is very closely related to what I just said. I think it is, so it isn't just the big manufacturer, the OEM, the original equipment manufacturer, that is asking the firms to do what to do, but it is their tier one suppliers that have this very close relation, and it is not the case with all of them. It is very few firms have this kind of relation, and it is. I'm not sure if I don't remember if I say it explicitly in the book because I didn't want to create any chance, but it's mostly the Japanese firms who have been doing that, and I think I've got that as a quote. So some of the suppliers I talked to, they said they prefer to work with Japanese OEMs and their tier one suppliers because they help them. They help them to do because sometimes they don't know. Sometimes there's a problem, and the supplier doesn't know what to do, and then the lead firm or their client come to help them. But that doesn't happen very often. It's only with these companies, but the other lead firms don't do this kind of stuff. I think I have that quote. I kind of like three different types of OEMs, or I wouldn't say maybe OEMs, but just the clients. They come with tier one sometimes. Some of them, I would say, it is more American OEMs. There's a problem with the product. They send the product back to the supplier and they say deal with it, and then they don't make an explanation what the problem is. While for example, the more like middle OEMs, they say this is the problem, deal with it, and tell me what you did about it. And the third group is that, which is very few. This is the problem, and I'm going to help you to solve the problem. So, but that third group is the very limited one. The first group is increasingly dominating, and it's also pushing the suppliers out of these chains. Fulya, that's a question I had. The federal and unitary systems. What is the impact? I kind of talk about it very, very little in the book, but not enough, probably. So because of the weak structure, maybe in Mexico, and also maybe that's related to the federal structure. So, for example, Mexican they have these training centers in different states. That is like created by the federal state, and then the regional states, they are free to do what to do with those training centers. And for example, the state in Guanajuato, which is central Mexico, it actually aligned this training center with the auto industry, while the state in Mexico City or state in the Nuevo León in the north, they didn't do that. So you have that impact of the state in Guanajuato is actually this institution is creating skills for automotive industry. But the funny part is that it's also, again, the foreign multinationals that are benefiting from this, while local Mexican companies, sometimes they don't even know that exists. So it is, I think, part of the FDI strategy of the Mexican, because that's also the case. These states in Mexico, they're also competing with each other to take FDI, to take the automotive manufacturers, and Guanajuato is kind of a latecomer. Compared to north and to the federal state of Mexico area. So that might be one way why they decided to do this thing, so that they can attract some of the newcomers of the automotive investments. And the other question, after NAFTA and EU, it's a very good question. That's a question I had when I started this project. And as you said, the EU has a lot of direct influence in terms of training. I actually wrote a paper with Ishigozal on this, and that's where we talk about that. And while the EU has this impact, NAFTA doesn't have this direct impact. NAFTA has the impact, I would say, more indirectly, because it opened it to the American market and American manufacturers. Which are not themselves interested in skill training. So maybe it had that kind of indirect impact of making it a more liberal skill system. But in that paper we showed it's not the NAFTA, but Inter-American Development Bank that's giving similar type of development programs so the certification system, for example, you mentioned, it also came to Mexico, but through Inter-American Development Bank. But its institutional capacity is much limited compared to the EU. And actually, in that paper, we show that it has been much more adopted in Turkey compared to Mexico, both because of the EU's impact, but also the role of the small, medium firms in both countries. They were more receptive of the institutional changes. The role of the 2008 crisis. And polarization. So I'm not sure about the crisis, the impact of the crisis itself, but I think the role of the polarization, maybe in the sense, so I don't think, that's not something I have observed myself, like I haven't observed the crisis has impacted the skill system, but what happened after the crisis affected. But it's, for one thing is that it's not related to the crisis itself, but Turkey's sales or service industry has grown compared to manufacturing. That's one thing that impacted. And the other thing is the Syrian refugees that have been coming after the crisis. And they have been having impact on the skill formation system. I don't know if we can link this to the crisis itself, but these are the stuff that have happened after 2008. So Syrian refugees started coming around 2010. And the service industry has been growing since, and then these have had impact on the labor market dynamics and the skill system. I have something I note from you for the role of economic production and what is on skills. I don't remember. No.
I talked about the e-car.
This is e-car. Yeah.
Cheap capital. You said something about cheap capital.
Oh.
No, I think it's e-car. I thought,
okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's e-car related to what I said about automation. I don't think as we move towards e-car, I'm very pessimistic in terms of having more Mexican or Turkish firms in the industry. I feel they will just move to other industries, except some in Turkey there are very few, in Mexico there are very few, but they are becoming like the big firms. So the firms I also talk to, my main aim was to talk to small and medium firms, meaning I thought it was just about the firm size, but then it wasn't just about the firm size because they're also part of the big conglomerates because they're the national capitalists and they are part of the national capital. Unless they are part of a big conglomerate or unless they have some relations with an international company which then takes over that company. During the field where I went to some firms thinking that they are Mexican, they just turned out to be recently bought by especially now also Chinese firms as well. So I think e-car or automation are going to affect it, but I don't think there's a future in the automotive industry in that sense for the local firms. The role between skills and inclusive growth, I think that's a good question too. I mean, I say more likely to lead to inclusive growth. I don't claim that it leads to inclusive growth. But I think if the question that you raised also is the case in Mexico. So I feel maybe that's kind of, in Mexico we didn't see an inclusive growth happening. It's especially like in the time period I look, which I feel like I finished my fieldwork in 2015, and things have changed since 2015. But and inclusive growth has also it's also I start this book with the idea that Turkey was shown as a good example of inclusive growth by the World Bank. There's a World Bank paper saying everyone should be like Turkey because Turkey managed to do this, but I think if you also even look at the poverty statistics, poverty decrease in Turkey, and if you look at inequality statistics, before 2015, inequality in Turkey, current income inequality is much lower compared to the income inequality in the 1980s. So those were the starting points of this thing. And I say that skills system could be one of the factors that has led to this kind of thing, but it is not stable, and because then, these Turkish workers, they increased their wages, but then they started not wanting to work in the manufacturing industry, so they moved to other industries. And now there's actually a skill labor shortage in Turkish manufacturing industry, which is, I think, is now currently being replaced by the Syrian refugees. And I think that's my end point. Thank you so much.
No, yeah. So before we open up to the floor, I would like to give the critics a chance to maybe come back on any of the points Merve made, if you wanted to. Yeah, Jeff.
I mean, just a couple of things which is interesting. First is looking forward. Two observations. Some suppliers might be better equipped to cope with disruptions, with the rise of electric cars, with the rise of low-cost suppliers and others, and they aren't always the ones you think. A few years back, I went in South Africa to a plant that was set up under apartheid to make truck engines to beat sanctions. Then it was bought by Mercedes. And then, interesting enough, the plant changed from just making truck engines to casting engine blocks. It's owned by Detroit Diesel, and it casts a lot of the Detroit Diesel engine blocks. So a lot of the suppliers at that stage just went, because they're basically making just engine blocks. On the other hand, odd suppliers did quite well, like there was a very small supplier who made specific wooden pallets to hold engine blocks. And obviously it was cheaper to make them locally than it was to actually, regardless of labour costs, whatever. The other thing is, of course, is one interesting thing in Germany is German firms, the one thing is they're very good at changing what they do, coming up with different products, even different industries, if one industry looks like it's on the way out, or different niches. And the question, of course, is, do some of these suppliers have the capacity to retread to do other stuff? Your point about authoritarianism and development, I think perhaps a lot of it's more about elite formation, because some developing states seem to have less predatory elites than others. And the other point, of course, which is interesting, is that what distinguishes an emerging from a mature market seems to be breaking down. Lots of, if you just take an extreme case, the US, apart from GDP per capita, a lot of the other indices are well in the case of emerging markets. And some emerging markets are quite good these days in infrastructural endowments. And even things like politics, you can't always distinguish them these days. Just an observation. And this might also have some salience, but yeah.
Okay. Yes, just one observation on the issue of authoritarianism and development. I mean, I think if you'd like to follow this path, I think this may be an absolutely compelling sort of line of inquiry. I mean, we have Gabor here, who's also on the authoritarianism and development. I think this is one of the big questions right now. And I mean, just a hint, Guillermo O'Donnell, a giant of Latin American social sciences, had this hugely influential book and series of contributions on bureaucratic authoritarianism. And he was basically taking the insights from dependency theory and try to apply it politically. And what he would say is that non-advanced political economies or peripheral political economies, what happens is at some point, if you want to go the high road, you need to, in a way, repress wages, but in a very even political way, so that to have the necessary capital investments and all sorts of state interventions necessary to bring you to the other stage while taking down your costs, your production costs. And this is why you got all the wave of authoritarianism, coup d'etat from the 1960s and on. This idea was then discredited and many things happened afterwards, but I think it's a very compelling case for how the structural determinants of being in the periphery implies that developing and social inclusion and political inclusion may sometimes diverge, in very specific ways. So maybe if you want to follow this, you can take from that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a very brief note on maybe building on the 2008 crisis and what it did to the automobile industry. The collapse of the demand, especially on the European market, which, automobile parts in Turkey basically mostly sell their products to Europe, right? And in addition to the local OEM manufacturers. So the collapse of demand also kind of had an impact on I think, hiring practices of the firms, which might have also pushed these people into the service industry, not because they just didn't like the manufacturing jobs, because it was dirty and too much work and low pay. But also it was just simply, I think, a matter of these structural constraints that the Turkish economy was basically finding itself in. So I think that might be also kind of an important point to consider going forward. I echo Aldo here to basically, look at these long-term development outcomes in light of also these structural constraints with respect to trade, with respect to global crises, and so on and so forth. But thank you.
Thank you. I realized I didn't respond to Fulya's questions. And thank you, I didn't think about the crisis in terms of the automotive industry, I thought in terms of the skills, but I think you're right. The other question you said was the workers' agency, maybe it's related to this. So I think you are one of the experts, like the unions in Turkey are very weak, and most of the places I talked to didn't have union presence. And so I actually try to talk to workers, but when the union isn't there, it happens through the HR, and that doesn't work. So that's why I didn't talk to workers or the unions within the companies, but then I talked to metal workers unions, which weren't concerned about skills or certification or anything because they have bigger concerns. They were more concerned about workplace accidents where people getting their hands chopped off because of that. So that wasn't their first concern. So that's my answer to that question. And the other thing, the historical reasons of this divergence, I think that's a great question. I actually even wrote a second project about that, why this is happening. And one of the reasons could be NAFTA versus EU, because especially the integration to the global economy was different. And the other reason is also Mexico's relations with the US versus Turkey's, especially in terms of the education system relations. The French education system has had a big impact on Turkish education system at the start, but then German companies also have had big impact. So those were my hypotheses, but I haven't done the research yet. Thank you.
So we've got plenty of time for questions from the floor, if there are any.
Yeah, thanks for the book and the excellent discussion so far. So, I mean, something in the orbit of SASE and the journal Socio-Economic Review is, of course, the discussion on comparative capitalisms. And in a way, this book is kind of like what everyone's calling for and wants to have, because people are fed up to just applying the varieties of capitalism, and another study about France, UK, US, Japan, Germany, these kind of usual suspects of countries, and everyone loves to write, these typologies are very limited how they apply to the rest of the world, and I just wondered, I mean, it can be just sort of how you think about it, but maybe also kind of interested in your thought process through the dissertation and the book. So do we take these existing categories, apply them, say they don't work, but if we were kind of like want to build like new theories and kind of like improve these theories, right, then we should discover some features of the context and kind of conceptualize them back out and feed them back into this our mapping. At least that's something I've been arguing, might be interesting to do. So you've done it, but is it interesting? Does it lead to some kind of, kind of macro level? How does it change like this, varieties of capitalism type of discussion? And, we've had papers in SCR that, going beyond the usual countries, and they make like 10 categories, and those of you who have been at SASE for a long time remember our friend Richard Whitley, who always had like many types of business systems, but his was a little bit like complex too, and then people don't always know, didn't really take up using all his little labels of this is compartmentalized or something. So just to invite you to kind of reflect on where we are in this kind of discussion and how your thinking has changed or evolved during your project.
Yeah. Should I respond or?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Gregory. That's great. Actually, that's my point here. So this is from the book, and I say thanks for Fulya for involving me. So now I can show it. This is what I actually want to get out of this book in terms of how it contributes to the varieties of capitalism. So varieties of capitalism looks only here and not the rest. And I think what Jeff said, it's about the firms. I also look at firms and also look at the links between national capitalism and globalization. So I thought, maybe this could be applied more when studying the capitalism or capitalist systems in like national capitalist systems, but I feel especially for countries that are not at the top of the global hierarchy, but at the middle or the bottom, because globalization and global value chains mean very different things for these countries compared to those who are at the top of the hierarchy. So this is what I want to get out of this. So basically look at the interactions between globalization or global capitalism and national institutions and national capitalism, and then see what it means at the micro level for firms or for workers, and what type of practices they lead to, and then what kind of outcomes do they bring for those firms and workers, and then can we make bigger claims out of this in terms of these countries, their development trajectories, or yeah. That's what I want to get out of it. Thanks.
Yeah, but is it a useful exercise in your view? Should we be coming up with like new labels or something, like Turkey as a such and such type of market economy? It's similar or different to Mexico in what ways? And some people have tried to, like Andreas Neuke, talk about in Eastern Europe, kind of like dependent market economy. So does that like extend to here? And because the mainstream of management studies is not really concerned with institutions, or sort of sees them as just sort of variables that you put in equation. And Turkey and Mexico would just be emerging. Or you mentioned weak institutions. So, okay, maybe that's a concept we should use, but that's a little bit like, strong, weak. It's very kind of one-dimensional type of concept. So, but I don't know, maybe this, kind of exercise, you can also say it's not useful, or, but would you, I don't know, how do you think of this, like, typologies of countries and how your research fits in this discussion? Yeah.
Should I? I don't want to come with typologies. I don't like typologies, but I think that was my starting point. So maybe it's useful to use typologies to start, but I wouldn't like to stick to typologies. Yeah.
That countries are unique. And
yeah. I think so. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Magnus Feldman, University of Bristol. We met many years ago, so I'm really excited to see how your project has developed since we spoke, and really exciting. I'm looking forward to reading the book. But I guess I wanted to ask a question, maybe in a similar kind of vein, but pushing in a slightly different direction from the one that Gregory just asked about the broader implications. But I wanted actually to ask more about how much of this carries over to other sectors in these countries. Obviously you haven't studied others, you're focused on the auto industry, which I think is a great decision, but you must have spoken to people who might have had opinions, may have made comparison to, what is it like in textiles or in various other sectors. And I was just wondering, how much of what you have found here would you expect to carry over to other sectors of these economies and perhaps more broadly? Thank you.
I think that was one of the questions. That's why I also skipped that question. That's also a question I had. How much does it? What we can use? I think it depends on the type of skills the automotive industry is using, but also the links between automotive industry and the global economy. I think that makes automotive industry maybe unique compared to other sectors, but I feel like we can use still like this kind of model. For example, my other question would be tourism industry, which is not super manufacturing skills, but it's, for example, in Turkey, it's still very vocational school heavy industry. So I feel it can be applied to that kind of, because yeah, if you think of tourism, you wouldn't think of it as one of the main, I would say, manual skilled job, but it is in Turkey. It's taught still through the vocational schools, and it is an important industry in Turkey. And other industry, which is textile industry, which I've been thinking about, it's another manufacturing, very much linked to the global value chains, but much more labor intensive. So I think that is a different picture. Maybe then it becomes more what type of skills are necessary. So I think in textile industry, because the vocational training doesn't exist, it's because it's much more dependent on the low skill labor. I mean, I think maybe in the tourism, it's also, you can say it's very low skill labor, but it is more customer facing industry. So those skills become more important, I feel. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Gabor sharing from Bocconi University, and I have 1.5 questions. So basically, if I get it right, I haven't read your book yet, but I will of course do it. So if I get it right, you make this argument that is in part a challenge against the classic varieties of capitalism thesis, which centers on firms. And in contrast, you stress the power of state and and state capacity. You know, that's where you derive your institutions from, and then they influence or determine how firms are going to behave, which leads to different developmental outcomes, which is clear enough, and I think it's a very important shift in attention. But this also raises the question then, where does state capacity come from, and what kind of actors might explain the different structures of the states in these different in these two countries. And just one example that might be relevant from our joint project comparing Turkey and Hungary is for example, the different power balances between technocrats, domestic technocrats, and different fractions of the business elites. So if you look at the dependent market economies of East Central Europe, what set them on a specific institutional trajectory was the power of the liberal technocracy at the end of the 80s, countries like Poland or Hungary, which led this dependency and you know, frustrated many of the domestic capitalists, which then started to fight back and created a new alliance, leading to a change in the state structure. And you can see this nationalist mutation of the regimes in Poland and Hungary. And I was wondering whether this might be something, for example, that could take place in Mexico, for example. So are there any social forces that explain the structure of the states themselves? I know this is a different focus from your book, but I'm just wondering, because you have the data, that might be useful to answer these questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and also something I had in mind. Actually, yesterday in a panel, that we have another colleague from Turkey who compares Mexico and Turkey, and then she compares the competition authority, and she compares. And I think that's my observation, but that's not my research in terms of education and training policies in Turkey or education training systems. In Mexico, and also in the case of competition authority, the bureaucrats, they are mostly economists, and they got their education in U.S. institutions or U.S. influenced institutions, while in Turkey, so in competition authority, she shows that they are not economists, and they apparently, I think about 69 people working there, only four have PhDs. So it is very, maybe it's like more, I don't know, I'm feeling maybe this is related to that question, because in terms of education ministries, something I found very interesting. In Mexico, again, they're all economists. They study economics, and they are just an appointed top-down to the Directorate of Vocational Education in Mexico. While in Turkey, they are teachers. They have worked as teachers. They have gone up, and then they start managing that department. And I feel maybe then they maybe want to more stick with the structure that was there rather than applying the theories that they learned in economics training. Yeah.
Hi, Natalie Langford, University of Sheffield. Thanks so much for a really excellent presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. Mine is more just a question about your kind of future research trajectory with this, and whether there are any other kind of countries and case studies that you're really kind of keen to kind of bring this comparative story to as well. So yeah, just a bit more about kind of what happens next in your research.
Thank you. So yeah, I think after this project, or during this project, I came up with all these questions: why the state in Turkey is more powerful than Mexico, and why the system in Turkey is like this than not in Mexico. And one thing I also observed in my research, there are much more women workers working in Mexico, not in Turkey. So I had all these questions in mind. But I think that in terms of, but I think the one that I stuck more so far was the refugees situation, because it is affecting the situation in Turkey. And I would maybe in the future want to see how is this like the new influx of workforce is affecting the skill systems, which I don't mean like about skilled workers, but the way that the dynamics in the labor market are working, but also maybe in other countries that are in a similar situation. I have Colombia in mind because they also have Venezuelans moving to Colombia, but also there are other countries. For example, I think the displaced people from Myanmar are also moving to the neighboring countries, but also I think Malaysia is an important example. They're not getting refugees, but they are creating migration policies to be able to get migrant workers in more labor-intensive sectors. So I think that's something I would like to do in the future. Thank you.
Any more questions? I've got a couple, if I may.
Okay.
So precisely also on this question of, well, it's something Fulya said actually about, the supply side of the story, which this book is very much, in the classical tradition of Hall and Soskis, in the sense of it looks at the institutional input side of things. And but I was sort of surprised. I looked at the index, and so maybe this is just the personality index, didn't put growth models there, but I don't think it figures prominently in terms of, this is sort of the new generation of scholars, and Geoff and I have this NPE special section on like how does this combine. I wonder whether you had thoughts on where does demand come in, macro aggregated demand. Is that something we don't need to consider? Was it a conscious choice not to talk much about that, or could it be something that in the next phase could complement the picture, joining more dots maybe?
I think it's a good point, and yeah, it's not in the book. It wasn't. It wasn't the point of the book, but I think that's something that I learned in the interviews. The demand is there, and actually, for example, it's something happened after the book. But when I was talking to firms in Turkey, they say we can't afford to pay this much to these workers, or we can't find workers. And they say if we pay more to these workers, then we can't compete with the countries in Eastern Europe, like in the same sectors. So that was putting a lot of pressures on them. But then we see, and then what happened in Turkey later was that in my opinion, it's so the inflation and then the currency, Turkish currency collapse. And I feel it is actually the government's kind of response to these employers' demands for cheaper workers. So it's not in the book, but it is out there, I think, yeah.
We've got time for a few more questions. I can continue because there's another thing I was really interested in, which is it's quite when I read the book, like the state, this claim about the state, more state leads to better skills and hence high road development strategies, but given how prominent that claim is, the state sort of does get a bit short shrift, right, in the book in terms of. For instance, the developmental state idea is not very prominent. Again, I looked at the index and I don't think it's there, right? Again, maybe it's the personality index, which was you, right? But
Yeah.
but you know, I don't know. I do wonder whether, because it does seem like also the question about the authoritarian, you know, corporatism. Like there's a lot that maybe, you know, South Korea's experience with, you know, suppressing wages through literally military force and things like that could add to this story, to that side of the story. And again, it's more, you know, a question: why did you choose maybe not to develop that side when it actually seems to be quite crucial to some of your claims, you know?
I think there is only as much I can do in a book or in a thesis. And that's the reason I actually didn't do it more. And I'm actually currently writing a paper on just the state aspect and how the state affects it's more historical, and it compares the state's involvement in Mexico and Turkey. But I think this was my main focus in the book. And then maybe just, for example, I don't know if I will have the energy to continue working on this, but one thing is about what Aldo said, but what about the firm's practices? That could be another paper, and the state could be another paper, but in the book I wanted to show this overall thing, yeah.
Just maybe I mean, it's a bit related to the demand thing, but a little bit maybe venturing off topic in the last minute here, but yeah, like, I mean, labor scholars love to study the automobile industry, and there's a lot of studies, and I never studied automobile industry because I hate cars, and I think they're, you know, from the beginning, the kind of downfall of planet Earth and, you know, the whole kind of lifestyle assumptions, and now for the first time, you know, we might be moving to a, you know, post-automobile world, or an idea of like away from the idea of, okay, you know, each family has their car and a street that bring, you know, and their garage and this, and maybe car sharing and electric cars. And the discussion in Germany is, of course, that electric cars have like, I don't know, instead of 10,000 parts or something, they have like, you know, 800 parts, and that's will have, you know, huge implications. So I just sort of wondered from this view of a more global view, is the discussion of like these like radical technological changes in the supply chain, does it come up, or these guys are business as usual till as long as it will go, or this kind of transformation just simply won't happen in Turkey or Mexico?
I think, so I did this project in 2015, lots changed since then, especially I think globally in terms of the environmental impact of cars, etc. But from Turkey's point of view, still Turkish government is claiming that we want to create a national car. So that's one of the aims of the current government, and we found new natural resources and we are going to extract them. So I don't think they are engaged with that as much. Yeah. Sorry, it was short.
Brilliant. If there are no other questions, I think we can have another big round of applause for Merve.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.